I'm Matthew Orr. I'm the owner and founder of VoIPTools and chief architect for all of our applications. So yes, I am a programmer by trade. Therefore, if you're expecting a smooth, polished presentation, I'm not your guy. So the hope today here is that we can talk a little bit about dialers and 3CX and our specific offerings when it comes to dialers. So I think the first conversation that we have to have is getting a little background about the different types of dialers because they aren't all the same. There are what I would classify as predictive dialers, power dialers, and preview dialers. And so we'll be talking about these different classifications of dialers and how our tools sort of fit into these classifications. It's important to understand that these are general classifications, but with different products, they may kind of bleed over into different categories, and our dialers are no different. They also kind of um, bleed over into other categories. So the first question, let's talk a minute about predictive dialers and whether 3CX is a good fit for hosting a predictive dialer. Let's talk a little bit first about some of the attributes of a predictive dialer. First off, it's important to understand the predictive dialers. And by the way, you spell dialer differently depending on whether you're in the United States or in Europe. So it isn't a typo. That's the way we spell it in the United States. So a predictive dialer is generally categorized as a very high volume, low touch dialer. And when I say low touch, we'll kind of discuss some of the challenges that come along with predictive dialers as we kind of dive deeper into what a predictive dialer is. But the idea behind a predictive dialer is that you give the dialer a list of contacts, it places the calls and connects them directly to the agent. So the first person that is interacting, or the first thing that interacts with the caller is the agent themselves, as opposed to an IVR or something like that. Predictive dialers, it's a bit of a marketing term. It should really, in my opinion, be called a best guess, best attempt dialer. And the reason for that is how it attempts to predict how quickly it can make telephone calls. And so let's talk about some of those pain points. The first one is how does a predictive dialer optimize the agent's performance? And it does that by trying to get a human being to answer the phone as quickly as possible. And how do they go about doing that? Well, it's going to use the average call length of calls over the last hour, for example, the number of agents that are involved, and the number of calls that are needed in order to get somebody on the phone. And then sort of use a fairly straightforward algorithm to try and figure out how many calls do I need to make and how quickly do I need to make them so that when an agent hangs up the phone, there's somebody there waiting for them the second they hang up the call. To do that, it needs to make multiple simultaneous calls for every agent. And it's not uncommon, for example, for a predictive dialer to make 3 simultaneous calls for every agent that you have. And so this is a bit of a pain point when it comes to 3CX licensing, because remember, 3CX is based on simultaneous calls. So the 3CX licensing platform works real well if you have lots of extensions and not all of those extensions are making telephone calls at the same time. But when you look at a predictive dialer, this is turning that whole licensing concept upside down, in that what's important to a predictive dialer is the number of simultaneous calls that it can make. So using a predictive dialer with 3CX means that you have to double, triple the size of your 3CX license based on the number of agents that you have. So might not be a great fit for that. The other challenge that's created by using dialers in general, but most specifically with predictive dialers, is that they place a lot of simultaneous calls, and they're quick, very short calls. Because I'm calling somebody, nobody answers, I hang up. I call somebody, the number's bad, I'm going to hang up. So it's going to have a lot of short calls, and a lot of SIP trunk providers charge an extra fee if you're using a dialer because of all of the simultaneous short calls that they're making. The other challenge with a predictive dialer is that one of its main features is to try and do voicemail detection. In other words, identify what answered the telephone call. Was it an IVR? Was it a voicemail box? Or was it a human being? And they're not always successful at making that determination. The other thing that we have to mention is that, well, it just plain guesses wrong quite frequently on multiple levels. Because you can imagine that the way that it determines how many calls to be made is based on averages. What's the average length of a telephone call that an agent is connected? How many on average calls do I need to make before I get a live human being? So if you've ever received, and I imagine everybody on this planet has received sales calls on their cell phone, and you answer the phone and you say hello, and there's nobody there. Hello? Still nobody there. Hello? And then all of a sudden it hangs up. The reason that this oftentimes happens is because the predictive dialer did its best guess at how many calls it was supposed to make based on when it thinks the agent is going to be available. It caught somebody on the phone faster than it expected, and the agent was on the phone longer than expected. And now we have a telephone call that's connected to a human being, and there's no agents available. So I am not a huge fan of predictive dialers. I much prefer a couple of different approaches, and we'll talk about some of those kinds of dialers here coming up. Now, in contrast to a predictive dialer, there is another class of dialers called a power dialer. And it has some slightly different purposes or aspirations. Power dialers, like predictive dialers, are high volume dialers. That means that they make a large number of calls in a very short period of time, but they're low touch dialers, meaning that this isn't the type of dialer that you would typically use when you're dealing with, for example, existing customers. And I could give you some examples, but let's not get too deep into the weeds before we jump into some demos and let you actually see some of our products. But unlike a predictive dialer or a preview dialer that we're going to talk about in a minute, a power dialer typically makes the telephone calls automatically, and the first thing that communicates with the human being that's answered the phone is the dialer itself. So it may give a prompt. So let's give some examples of use cases of power dialer. The most frequently one that you and I would be involved in is appointment reminders. So something like, this is Dr. Smith's office reminding Matthew that he has an appointment tomorrow at 2 o'clock at our West Side Clinic. Press 1 to accept to confirm your appointment, or press 2 to reschedule. That would be the function of a power dialer. And we'll show you a power dialer here in just a couple of seconds. Power dialers are also useful for doing things like collections. Power dialers oftentimes, our dialer does, use text to speech to generate a unique message for each person that it calls. So you could imagine a scenario where You get a telephone call like this. This is a call for Matthew Orr. This is your local cable company. Your current bill is overdue 28 days. Your current balance is $325. If we don't receive a payment in the next 24 hours, your services will be disconnected. If you've already made a payment, press 1. If you'd like to talk to a billing specialist to make a payment, press 2. So those are the kinds of things that you could use a power dialer for. Another one's emergency notifications. We have a municipality that's using our power dialer in Canada, and this town has an ongoing problem with moose coming through town. And so what they use the dialer for is to call all the shopkeepers and tell them keep all of your patrons in the buildings and lock your doors because there's a moose coming through town. We'll let you know when the moose has been taken care of, but for now, keep everybody inside. You might use it for a political campaign. In this case, it's playing a message and then hanging out. So it might say something like, I'm the greatest politician in the whole wide world. Tomorrow's election day. Be sure to get out and vote for me. Thank you. Goodbye. Any kind of cold call where you're just trying to crank out as many telephone calls as you can. These aren't people that you're already engaged with. So you've just gotten a list from some list provider and you don't care if you burn through the list. You're just trying to optimize the agent's productivity. So if you'd be interested in our product, press 1, that kind of thing, right? And then, of course, something like a snow day. The thing that we have to be careful when we're talking about using a power dialer for either emergency notifications or snow day closings for schools is that 3CX again is based on simultaneous calls. And in the example of a snow day for a school, I've got hundreds, if not thousands, of parents to call in a very short period of time. And I have to have enough SIP trunks and I have to have enough simultaneous calls on my 3CX server to make the telephone calls in a very short period of time before people start leaving home and heading to school. So that gap between when they make the decision that it's a snow day and we're going to delay school opening and the time that we need to get all the calls done before people start leaving, there has to be enough time there and you have to have enough simultaneous calls. So that's something to be aware of. All right, so let's do a demo of the 3CX Power Dialer. So I should mention that this is a list of our tools. This is a little side panel application that I wrote to make it simple to access all of our applications from a single user interface. So we'll just collapse that guy a little bit so that we have a little more space. And let's go and look at our dialer. So remember, power dialers, typically this is used to make a large volume of telephone calls in a short period of time, and it is typically regarded as a low-touch dialer. I will grudgingly admit, because I'm not a huge fan of predictive dialers, that we are starting to incorporate some predictive type functionalities into our power dialer. But let's start with the easy example of an appointment reminder. Going back into ancient history, I used to have a IT services company. And so we were going to an ophthalmologist's office and putting in new servers and upgrading their workstations and doing various work that went over multiple days. And one of the things that I noticed after the first couple of days is that there was a little lady sitting off in a corner making telephone calls all day long. That's all she did was make telephone calls, calling patients to remind them of their appointments and getting a confirmation or rescheduling those appointments. And I got to thinking about how much that must cost that practice to have an employee whose sole purpose is dedicated to making appointment reminders. And you think about that. Let's say the employee makes $20,000 a year plus Social Security taxes and those kinds of things, plus sick days and holidays. We're probably talking $30,000, $40,000 a year to pay for that person sitting off in the corner. And I thought, oh, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so we built this dialer. So let's talk a little bit about appointment reminders. How do we decide who we're going to call? Well, we'll show you the import process here in just a moment, but let's pretend that we have a repository of contacts that we need to call. In the example of an ophthalmologist, they'd be patients. So we would import a list of people that are scheduled to have an appointment tomorrow, and we'd give it a list name. So this is just general, straightforward SQL syntax for querying it. And for those of you who don't know SQL, you might be panicking a little bit going, oh, I don't know SQL. How are we going to do this? Let me give you an assurance that our support team and developers will work with you to build the necessary queries that you need to run your campaign. So you don't need to be a SQL expert. Our support staff will help you in building the necessary queries against the data so that you can do what you want. Typically, once you've got it set up, all you have to do is change the date of this import. And that's the only change you need to do to make the query go. All right, so you give it a query, and you'll notice that I didn't say which fields I needed. I just said, give me all the fields from the contacts database, and it built this grid and displayed the information based on what was returned from the database. And this is important because you don't have to use the Power Dialer database. If your backend CRM practice management software has a SQL interface or a MySQL interface, we can go directly to the CRM and pull these contacts out and build the grid of information here based on your specific needs. And that all happens automatically. You don't really have to do anything special. We've built that into the tool. But because we don't know what the structure of this grid, this table of data is going to be, you need to tell the dialer which of these columns contains the phone number. So if you go down here, I press get data, it goes out to the database, finds some people to match that list, and then I come in here and I select which field is the phone number. So it could be the main phone number, it could be mobile number, it could be whatever field is returned by your query. So you're going to specify the phone number that is going to be used for doing this dialer campaign. Well, what's this email thing here? What do I need an email for in order to do a phone campaign? And what on earth do I need an SMS number for if this is a phone campaign? Well, this should be a clue that this Power Dialer does a little bit more than just make telephone calls. You can also simultaneously have an email campaign and an SMS text campaign. That's all running at the same time. We'll talk a little bit more about SMS in just a minute. All right, so we've identified who the contacts are that we need to get in contact. What happens when somebody answers the phone? That was the phone call that was generated by the dialer. And because we're doing an appointment reminder, we need to tell them when their appointment is, right? So you come in here, and if you select scripted, we can use text-to-speech to generate the audio that's played to the person when they answer the phone. Alternatively, you can upload a pre-recorded list, a pre-recorded message that you wanted to play. That's typically more appropriate for a political campaign or moose in town or something like that. But let's look at the scripted one. Now, I think people are starting to clue in that text-to-speech isn't the horrible robotic voice that it used to be. Anybody that's ever used an Echo Dot or Alexa, that's an Amazon product, you've come to realize that text-to-speech actually works really, really well. And in fact, we use the same um, text-to-speech engine that Amazon uses for their Alexa Echo Dot stuff. So now we're talking about the quality of a text-to-speech message that is approaching human being quality. So you don't need to worry about quality of that speech. It's something that has gotten really good. I think we have some examples on our website as well. If you want to go to our Power Dialer landing page on our website, there's some examples there. Obviously, I'm not gonna even tempt fate to see if my audio is working and that you can hear it. So I'm not going to play it right now, but if you need some examples on our website. All right, so what's these funny bracket things around these things? Well, when you go to variables, it's going to look at that grid of data that was returned by your query, and it's going to make each of the fields that were returned by that query a variable that you can then put into your text to speech. So let's just for fun choose country. So I'm going to copy that guy and I'm going to paste him right in here. Paste. And then I'm going to verify my script. So if I click on verify, what I'm seeing is this is a test of Matthew Orr, and somebody's put a dollar figure inside the country code for whatever the test data had a dollar figure in there. But now you see how this could be used for collections. You can also do dates. If I go over here again and look at the variables, there's an explanation of how you can tell the interpreter that the variable that I've inserted is a date or a time, and then it will treat that differently. So instead of saying 03/04/2020, it's going to say June 23rd, 2020, Tuesday at 2 o'clock, that kind of thing. So you can get fairly sophisticated with generating this information, again, verifying it by doing text to speech, and it found the first record that matched in the list of people that I'm supposed to call, and I happened to be the first person in there, so it inserted my first name, my last name, and my country, but somebody's put a date in the country field. Okay, and then if you want to hear the message, I'm not going to click on this because I don't know what it would do in an environment where I don't have an audio card. But this would play the audio and you can listen to it. And if you decide, oh, you know what, I'd like a little pause between this word and that word, you just put a comma in there. So this gives you a feedback loop that lets you refine the message that you're going to play to the end user. By the way, an interesting side note is that Amazon must have an absolutely gigantic library of proper names because it does a really, really good job of pronouncing people's first and last names. So that's another thing that's kind of nice about leveraging the Amazon text-to-speech engine. All right, so this is how you basically create the message that's customized for each user when the dialer calls them on the phone. Well, we can do the same thing with an email. So you give it a subject name, you go to variables, and I can insert anything in here that I want. So we'll put in first name. So we got country there. I'm going to put first name here so that you can see that I'm not just doing smoke and mirrors. This is real stuff. And then when I verify it, you'll see that it has the dollar amount, which somebody put in the country field, and my first name. Okay? So much the same way you can do email and you can do SMS. Again, same way, go to variables, insert them in here. Now, why do I have a different template for audio, email, and SMS? And the reason is that the amount of data that you can put into a text message, for example, needs to be very concise. And so an email, in contrast, can contain a lot of detailed information. And an audio is somewhere in between, I would guess, is that you'd want it to be fairly concise to limit the amount of time that you're sucking up with your SIP trunk provider, but also nobody wants to listen to a long audio message and they'll hang up if it's too long. So giving you ability to fine tune the messages based on the platform that you're using to convey the information, it's important that you have that ability. But let's talk about one limitation with the SMS feature, and that is that every SIP trunk provider that has SMS enabled trunks has their own API. At least that's been my experience so far, is that none of them use the same API. So if you want to do an SMS campaign, it is likely going to require that we do an integration with your particular SIP trunk carrier. Alternatively, if you have a well-known group of people that you're contacting, let's say it's an emergency notification to your employees, for example, like, hey guys, don't come into the office today, it's a blizzard, just work from home. That kind of message. You can use, at least in the United States, every cell phone carrier has a email to SMS gateway. In other words, you send an email to vtext.com. That is Verizon's email to SMS gateway. So it would be the telephone number at vtext.com. If you send an email to that, Verizon will grab that email, look at the subject line, grab the telephone number, then read the body of the email, convert that to an SMS text message, and then send it to that telephone number. So if it's a well-known, obviously you're not going to know who the carrier is of all of your patients, so it won't work in that scenario. But in a scenario where we're dealing with people that you can reasonably ask them who their carrier is, you can do SMS messages without having to have any special integrations that happen. Okay. So that's kind of the general setup of what it's going to say. We've defined who we're going to call, what's going to happen when they answer. Let's look at the next step. Now, the Power Dialer has a number of different campaign types. Remember, I told you that we're kind of starting to dabble into the direction of a predictive dialer. That's where things get a little bit crossing over into different categories. So we've been talking about an appointment reminder, but there are other types of dialer campaigns that we can do. For example, play announcement. That's one where there's a moose in town, keep everybody indoors, and it hangs up. Or I'm the best politician in the world, vote for me tomorrow. That would be a play announcement. Transfer call to extension is a scenario where you call somebody on the phone and then you just transfer it to an IVR or to a survey or something like that. Transfer call to agent, this is the one where it's starting to kind of tiptoe over toward the predictive. What this dialer campaign does is you specify monitor this queue in 3CX. See how many agents are in that queue and how many of them are logged in and available and their present status is available and that kind of stuff to determine whether they're really available. And then it will make the appropriate number of telephone calls based on the agents in the queue and available. That way, when it calls somebody on the phone and the contact answers the phone, the call will be immediately transferred to a queue. That queue has no on-hold music, so the contact doesn't hear anything. And because we already know that an agent is available, the agent's going to get one ring and answer that phone. That whole process of calling the contact once they answer, to the time that the agent can answer is about a second if the agent is paying attention and ready to grab that phone. Now, if, for example, you're using the 3CX phone for Windows, you can set it to auto answer, in which case that time between when the customer answers the phone and when the agent answers the call is even shorter. So in our testing and feedback that we've gotten from our customers is that it happens so quickly that the customer doesn't even know that the agent just wasn't there. To them, it feels like it's just a human being was there when they said hello. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the agent. Let's start at the top. You specify when the campaign can start and when the campaign can end. You can set these up in advance. So if you know that your call center staff is going to be in at 9 o'clock, you could set this all up at 8 o'clock in the morning and initiate the campaign, and it'll just sit there and wait until it's 9 o'clock. And when 9 o'clock rolls around, then it'll start making these telephone calls. This allows you as an administrator, as a manager of the team, it allows you to get everything set up and ready to roll. So the second that your staff are ready to do it, it just goes. So that's the start time, and this is the end time. Now, obviously, you're going to let this dialer campaign go, but you don't want to be making calls to people at 1 o'clock in the morning. So typically you would say, I don't know, maybe 6 o'clock in the evening is the latest that you'd want to be calling people. So you can set an end time. This could encompass multiple days if you wanted, but I think most frequently people are just talking about a start time and an end time that is within the current day. All right, you select the type of campaign that you want. What is this total max system calls thing and this max dialer calls thing? Well, one of the things we want to be very careful about is overwhelming your 3CX server with dialer calls. You want to reserve some of those telephone calls, those simultaneous calls available on your PBX for customers to call in or for staff to do ad hoc telephone calls. So let's say hypothetically that you have a 32 simultaneous call 3CX license. If I set this total maximum system calls to 26, what that means is that before the dialer makes its next call, it's going to check and see if there are already 26 calls running on the system and active at that time. And if there is, it's going to pause for 2 seconds, and then it's going to check again and say, okay, has somebody hung up the phone? And so as long as it's underneath that 26 simultaneous call licenses, it'll dial. But once it reaches 26, it's going to say, all right, I got to wait until more call paths are available. All right, well, how's that differ from this one, max dialer calls? You can also specify the maximum number of simultaneous calls that are generated by the dialer. So if I only have 100 people to call and the average call takes about 30 seconds, I can get through that list pretty easily without overwhelming my PBX. So if I make 3 calls at a time, that should be fine. I should be able to get through my entire list that day. So these are just tools for monitoring the activity of the 3CX and the dialer to make sure that it doesn't consume all of the resources of your SIP trunks or your 3CX server. Call only once, don't retry. What this means is that well, you could look at, maybe it's easier to look at it as the opposite. If I don't check that, it's going to call somebody on the phone, and if the phone was busy, it's going to put that person at the bottom of the list, and when it gets to the bottom of the list, it's going to call them again. So if they're busy, if they don't answer, we're going to call them multiple times, but eventually give up. So that's what this checkbox is for. Now, in the case of an appointment reminder campaign type, there's another limitation that we want to put on the dialer so that it doesn't overrun the 3CX server. In the case of the ophthalmologist that we were working on many years ago, that little lady rescheduling appointments could only handle one call at a time. So if I put 100 people in the queue waiting to reschedule their appointment, she would have gotten overwhelmed and people would have got angry because they'd be sitting there waiting in the queue for an hour and 45 minutes waiting for her to become available to reschedule them. So what you can do is you can say, monitor this queue and how many people can be waiting in the queue before I pause the dialer. So this is set to 2. So in other words, if there's already 2 people waiting in the queue wanting to reschedule their appointment, pause the dialer. So 26 simultaneous calls, pause the dialer. 3 calls already active that were generated by the dialer, pause the dialer, don't make more. If there are already 2 people waiting in the queue, pause the dialer. So these are all approaches for trying to not overwhelm the 3CX server or the support staff that are taking those calls when somebody says, I'm not available for an appointment. But is this just good for appointments? Well, the answer is no. What this really is play a message and give me options afterwards. So it could be just as easily, this is your cable company reminding Matthew that his payment is past due 28 days. He owes $350. If you've already made a payment, press 1. That's a lot like confirming an appointment, isn't it? Press 1 if you've already made a payment, or press 2 to talk to a billing specialist to make a payment. Well, that's a lot like transferring somebody to a queue to reschedule their appointment, isn't it? So the idea behind this dialer campaign is really play whatever message you want to play and then give them an option to confirm or to be transferred to a queue where somebody can work with them. So you could also use it another way. I'm your local heating and air conditioning company, and we are running a special this week that will we'll do a free evaluation of your heating air conditioning system. If you what would be a polite way of saying it? If you're not interested, press 1. If you'd like to schedule a free appointment, press 2. So collections, appointment reminders, cold calls, all of these things all kind of fit into that appointment reminder campaign type. All right, so I've got it all set up. I've got all of my criteria, my restrictions on this dialer set up. What do we do next? Come to the run screen. And every time you run a campaign, what it's going to do is it's going to go to the query that you generated under the contacts tab, and it's going to grab all the people that match the criteria you've specified, and it's going to put them into a list, and it's going to give that list a date and time, a run date and time. So I'm going to select one that I did this morning just to make sure that everything was working so I could test it here. And you see it says answered right now. That's because I've already run this campaign. But normally, the first time through, this would be blank, right? So, okay, I'm all ready to go. I've got the list of people that I want to call. I press the start button, and it'll start calling these people. And as the status of that call gets determined, whether it was rang and nobody answered, or it was a bad number, or they answered the phone, those statuses will be updated on this list. And it'll just keep working through the list. Well, let's say lunchtime comes and we all want to take a break because we've been slamming through all of these telephone numbers and we could all use a break. When I press the start button, then the stop button becomes available and I can press the stop button. and that'll pause the dialer. That'll stop it from dialing any more people. And whether I choose to start it up in an hour after lunch or I choose to start it up the next day doesn't really matter. I've got a list of people that I'm supposed to call, and as soon as I press start again, it'll start where it left off and continue on working with this list. And it'll keep going until all of the telephone numbers are gone, or you delete the run altogether, or the start and end time has been reached. The maximum end time has been reached. So that's kind of how you run a campaign. I should also mention, so while the campaign's running, it's going to show you the total active calls on the system. This is a progress bar, right? And it knows the number of simultaneous call license you have. So it'll show a progress bar. So if you're wondering, well, why did the dialer stop dialing? None of my agents are getting telephone calls right now. You can come and look at this system, and if it shows that it's got 28 simultaneous calls going, you go, oh, well, it stopped dialing because there's too many people on the phone system already. Okay, fine. Or it could be that there are too many people waiting in the queue. So this will show you a progress bar of how many people are waiting in the queue. And I think this is actually mislabeled. I think this is the total number of calls that are currently active that were initiated by the dialer. And I should mention to them that they need to rename that label. And then this last one shows you the overall progress. How far have you made it through your list of names that you're supposed to call? And in this particular campaign, I only had 2 people, so that's why the progress bar goes all the way across, is that because it called everybody in the campaign. All right, and of course, then once the campaign's all done, you can export the results in various formats that you can then import into your CRM or practice management software, something like that. All right, so if we go back to, what is it, setup, let's take a look at some of these other campaign types. We're almost done with this, by the way, and we'll move on to the next dialer here in just a second. If I choose play announcement, you'll notice that there's no queue that I can select from here because it just plays an announcement and hangs up. If I choose transfer call to an extension, you'll see here's a list of extensions that I can transfer the call to. So the options that display on this screen are specific to the type of campaign that you choose. And then again, if I go to transfer call to agent, now you'll notice that it doesn't say what's the maximum number of people that can be waiting in the queue, because that's irrelevant. What's important is how many agents are available to take the call. So that's why that field isn't there. All right, what else? We never talked about the import screen. Let's look at that real quick. How you get people into the repository that the dialer uses is pretty straightforward. You just browse to a CSV file. I don't have one here, and I could make one real quick and show you, but these webinars tend to go too long anyway. So you browse the CSV file, you give it a list name, and oftentimes I'll just use a date for the list name. Specify whether the CSV file is a comma separated or tab separated file, and then press Get Fields. And it will read that CSV file, and the requirement is that the first row in the CSV file is the column names. And so it will display those column names in this grid here. And then you just match. First name goes to contact first, last name goes to contact last, and so forth. And once you've mapped the structure of your CSV file to specific fields within the dialer database, you never have to do it again. So if you're always getting the data from the same source, for example, and export from your practice management software, it's always going to have the same format. So you only have to do this mapping step one time. Once that's done, all you do is browse to the CSV file, give it a name, and press import. And it's that simple. So it's click, 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 and you're done. All right, so I think that's the main aspects or features of the Power Dialer. There's more that we could go into for reports and settings. Maybe we could jump in here real quick and look at some settings. You can set up your SMTP server for email campaigns and SMS campaigns. You can set up whether you use Windows text-to-speech engine or Amazon Poly. There's some advanced things that you can do about adding digits or stripping digits from telephone numbers before it makes the dialer. This appointment type is really for a little mini CRM that we've built into this application for allowing you to put campaign appointment types. So if you have no practice management software or CRM, you can use this little built-in CRM, and it's super ultra minimalist. It's just give me a list of people and when their appointments are, that kind of thing. All right, and then reports are just going to show you who was called, what type of campaign was called, when was the call made, those kinds of information. Do we have some data here? I guess I do. Do I? Yeah. So I had a little bit of information here from the campaign that I ran this morning. And again, you can export this information. So you can group them by campaigns. If you want to group them by phone number, I guess, or phone status, which calls were answered and which ones were not. Well, in this case, both of them were answered. So some very simple ways of creating some complex reports with grouping and sorting and filtering and all that stuff. So I could also filter it by the dialed number here. So if I put 80801, it would filter the list of people as you saw. Now it's only showing people with 801. So if you wanted to know specifically when was this telephone dialed, you can go in and put in that telephone number and you can see what campaign was used, what date and time it was used. So some very simple, I should say, straightforward ways of manipulating historical information. Okay, so preview dialers. Okay. So this is, again, another class of dialer. We've talked about predictive dialers. We've talked about power dialers, and I've given you a demo of the power dialer tool. What the heck is a preview dialer? Well, preview dialers are a specific use case. They are a very low volume dialer, meaning few people are called in a short period of time, but they are a high touch dialer. And we'll kind of talk about some of the advantages of a preview dialer here in just a moment, but I wanted to kind of go over the basic attributes of this classification of dialer. Again, the dialer calls all of the people, but unlike a power dialer, the first person that answers the phone is the agent. It's not going to be a pre-recorded message or a text-to-speech message, which is common of a power dialer, although our power dialer cheats and can do some predictive dialing where it ends up at an agent is the first person to answer the phone. But as a general category, what's common to all preview dialers is that a human being answers the phone. And some use cases. This is important. Existing customers is a typical use of a preview dialer. Let me give you an example. In fact, our preview dialer, which we call Surveyor, and I'll show you in just a moment, was written specifically for Minneapolis Star Tribune, which is a large regional newspaper out of Minnesota. And they have a lot of people that they need to call on a regular basis. Now, one of the things that I never really realized about newspapers is that they don't make their money from selling newspapers directly. Where they really make their money is on the advertisements that go into the newspaper. So could you imagine a scenario where somebody who has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars um, advertising in the newspaper gets a robocall saying, "What would you like to advertise this to tomorrow?" That would be kind of insulting. Wouldn't you feel insulted that you weren't important enough to actually get a dedicated salesman to call me on the phone and work with me on how I'm going to advertise? So in this scenario, what we need to do is make sure that it's a human being that they're connected to, and that when they answer the phone, there's a human being at the end of that telephone line every single time. Unlike a predictive dialer, where you can call somebody and hope there's an agent available and that the predictive, in quotation marks, guessed right, or you can use a preview dialer. So let's talk about some of the other um, uses of a preview dialer. You can use a preview dialer oftentimes in conjunction with a power dialer. So let's take a collection activity, for example. The first time you try and get the person to pay, we're going to use a power dialer that says, "This is a call for Matthew. This is your local cable company. You're 28 days past due. Your outstanding balance is $350. If you've already made a payment, press 1. If you need to talk to a billing specialist, press 2. Well, as soon as they hear the message, it's the collections company, they hang up. I don't want to talk to them. I don't have the money to pay it, right? So you've tried a couple of times with the power dialer. That didn't work. Now let's try a human being. So now when they answer the phone, instead of them hanging up on an IVR, now they're hanging up on a human being. So when they answer, a human being says, "Hey, this is Matthew from the cable company. I really need to talk to you about your outstanding balance. Can you help me out here? We've been trying to get a hold of you and haven't been able to get you on the phone." So you can use a preview dialer in conjunction with a power dialer as the second effort to get that. But what if the agent needs to have a little background about this person? How many times did we try and call them? What were the commitments that were previously made? What's their annual income? Are there other people in the household that are employed? Those kinds of information, so that when they say, "Oh no, I don't have any money," well, you told us last Thursday that you were going to make a payment. Now it's Monday, we still haven't got a payment. You didn't follow through with your commitment. So having some background about what happened is useful, and that's why they call it a preview dialer, because the agent is presented all the background information about the person that they're about to talk with, so that when they answer the phone, they can, in a positive scenario, talk to the person like they're best buddies. Okay, so again, some of the advantages is that there's always going to be a human being at the other end of that phone when that person answers the phone, and the agent knows all about the customer before the customer answers the phone. I mentioned that this is a low volume dialer, and I think oftentimes when people look at dialers, one of the things that's in the back of their mind is that a dialer is going to help me make a zillion more calls than I could make if my agents are dialing it themselves. And that's true. But I want to make sure that when we talk about the context of a preview dialer and the fact that it makes a lower volume number of calls than a predictive or a power dialer, that we don't lose sight of one important fact. And that is the ultimate goal of using the dialer to make a lot of telephone calls, or is it really to have a successful interaction with the customer? A sale, for example. And I think we would all agree that the whole point of this exercise is to get a sale, not how many telephone calls we make. And so if the interaction between the agent and the contact is a much more favorable conversation, you're much more likely to have a positive end result. All right, so we've been talking about previews. Let's talk a little bit about our preview dialer. Again, this is our Surveyor tool. This is our preview dialer. I have often said that I really ought to change the name of this product to 3CX Preview Dialer. I think people will understand what it is a lot better if I change the name. So you might find that this product in the next little while has a name change from 3CX Surveyor to 3CX Preview Dialer. But in any case, let's talk a little bit about a preview dialer. So the first thing that you would do, let me collapse this so we have a little more screen space too. So the first thing we would do, like the power dialer, is we would set up a campaign. And so I've already created a campaign here, and I've created a list inside that campaign. And let's take a look at it. So I just give the list a name, again, a start date and an end date, much like we did with the power dialer. We can set it as active or inactive. You might want to set it at inactive if you're setting this all up in advance, but you're not quite ready to make it available to your agents. And then when you're ready to make it to your agent, you simply send it to active, and now they'll get access to it. You might have a script that the agent is supposed to read. So this is a test script. So you can put pictures, you can do fonts, you can do colors, you can make this as fancy as you want, but typically this is a bullet list of items that the agent is supposed to remember to talk to the contact about, or it could be an exact script that says, hello, Mr. Brown, this is Matthew Orr, I'm calling you about blah, 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 right? Here, we've taken this one a little step further in its development than we did with the power dialer. I should probably change this, but here I don't need to know SQL syntax at all. So I can add additional criteria, and it knows all of the fields that I can select from. So I've said that the state is Wisconsin, and what else do I have here? Do we have a contain? Let's see, and company name. Company begins with the letter V. And I'm going to apply that. And now it's filtered this list to only show those people where the company name starts with V. I didn't need to know anything about SQL syntax for creating this query against the repository of people that I'm supposed to call. So it's a little bit easier in this tool, but this is how you identify who you're going to call. And again, it has an import screen that's identical to the power dialer's import screen, so we won't go over that again. And then you assign agents to this campaign. So you can see right now that Samuel and I are both listed in this campaign. This means that you can have as many agents as you want working against the same campaign at the same time. That's fine, no problem. Or you can set up a separate campaign for each agent. It's up to you how that works. All right, so we save the changes, and that's how you create a campaign. So manager does this up front. And when he's all ready to go, he says, okay, call center staff, go in and start using the campaign. So when they log in, because they're not managers, the only menu option they'll see is dialer and about. They won't be able to see these other settings. That's also true, by the way, for the power dialer, is that the ability to create campaigns and manipulate campaigns is restricted to managers in 3CX. So again, we're all very directly tied into 3CX. When you log in, you see that I've logged in as extension 1001. When I put in my username and password, it's going out to 3CX and it's verifying my credentials and checking to see if I'm a 3CX admin or a 3CX manager or just a plain user. And based on that information that's returned by 3CX, it will restrict what I can see within the Power Dialer. So if I were logged in as just a user, the only thing that I could do is go in here to the dialer screen. So they come into the dialer screen and they will go in here and say, well, what campaigns have I been assigned to? Okay, so I've been assigned to this campaign. And within that campaign are potentially one or more lists. So let's see what list I've been assigned to. Okay, so I click on that, and what it does is it goes through and it finds the first person that I'm supposed to call. And so typically what happens is I will then press the dial button and my phone will ring and I will answer my phone and I will hear on hold music while 3CX is attempting to contact this person who's Matthew Orr, whose telephone number is this. Actually, that's not my telephone number, but you get the idea. Now, some of this is a little bit hard to read on this particular monitor. This is a little bit grayer than perhaps I'd like. But the reason this is gray is because the manager has gone in and identified what fields I'm allowed to change and which ones I'm not. And I'll show you how the interface for controlling those kinds of things. But basically, here's the telephone number that it's going to dial. While the phone is ringing, I'm reading history information. So if there's a priority note in here, it'll be in bold red letters, customers on credit hold or something like that. In addition to that, I'll see notes that were entered into the system from previous calls to this customer. So I can see history of all of the contacts that happened to that person, what commitments were made if this was a campaign for collections, that kind of thing, right? So I can do things like find out when their first order was or last order. These are all fields that you can commandeer for your own purposes, and I'll show you in a minute how you commandeer these fields. If this one's a prior ad, this was written as a widget specifically for Minneapolis Star Tribune. They wanted to know what was the last advertisement that that person put into the magazine. Well, I'm not a magazine, so I don't need this widget. So I'm going to get rid of it. And you'll notice that the widget then comes up here and it becomes available again, right? So if I don't need a particular widget or if I don't need a script, remember that script that we used to create the campaign? And I told you in there that it said this is a test script. There's that test script right here. So this would be the bullet list of things to remember to talk about. If this is a cold call and I don't have specific things I need to talk to the customer, I could get rid of that too. And now I can reorganize my screen a little bit. That's kind of cool. This is a web page, and yet I can drag widgets around on the screen and I can resize them. If I put that script back on here, now I can take the whole screen. I got some real estate left on my screen. Let's make it bigger so that I can see more of my script at a time. Or maybe I want to see the script first, and I'll look at the other stuff later. So I can customize these widgets that are displayed and what order they're displayed and what size they are and save them by clicking on this button here. And it will save that layout, and it's unique to each person so they can set it up the way that they like to work. And if I want to set it back to a default, you can hit that. Okay, so the idea here is that when that person answers the phone, I know what ads they placed yesterday, or I know whether or not they're a homeowner, what they, so here's another widget for pre-qualifying, and this was a widget that we created for a solar company in Australia, and these were specific things that they needed to know to pre-qualify the person. And so it's got menu options here like yes, no, yes, no. Are these all yes, no? Oh, no, less than 3 years. So you can control what the labels are for all of these widgets and for what data shows up in these combo boxes. If you need a custom widget, as you can see, I've created a couple of them specific to customers. But most people find that we've got a widget that meets their needs and they can commandeer the fields forever they want. So you could, for example, this in the contacts widget, you'll see that it has a company, an owner, a buyer, and a receptionist. Well, you might instead want to make this head of household, spouse, whatever you want to. They're just text fields, so you can put in here whatever you want. So there's some customization that's available. In any case, now when the person answers the phone, you can say, "Hi, Bob. How's your wife?" I read in the notes that your wife is going back to college. So now when he answers the phone, I can say, "Hey, Bob, how's school going for your wife?" And now Bob thinks that I know who he is. In reality, I'm calling 10,000 people. I couldn't possibly know all these people. But because I look at some of the history about this person, I can talk to this person as if we're best buddies. And now we're having a much more pleasant, positive conversation. So if I'm a newspaper and I've got a customer that spent $100,000 advertising, I sure as heck better give the impression that I know who they are and know a little bit about them. So that's some of the value positions of a preview dialer. Okay, so the call is ended. I've added some more notes in here about the call. Yeah, we had a great call. He agreed to do a full page spread in tomorrow's newspaper, sample advertisement documents to follow, something like that. Now that becomes part of the history that I can then review over time. But what happened to the call? There's also the ability to disposition that telephone call. So you see, I called this number and that number no longer works. Or I called that number and the phone was busy. Or whatever kind of disposition you want. These are not fixed. These are optional. It goes into a database and looks at the dispositions that you've created. So you have control over all these dispositions, but they can't go to the next person they're supposed to call until they've dispositioned the call. Well, let's say I called somebody and the wife answers the phone and says, "Oh, my husband's away right now, but he'll be back at 6 o'clock. So if you want to call him at 6 o'clock on his cell phone." Okay, so I'm going to change this to 6 o'clock, right? So I set a date and time for the callback. And then what was his cell phone number? Oh, okay, cool. I'll call him back. Okay. So now we have a date and time for that callback. When I press next to say who's the next person I'm supposed to call, and remember, multiple agents potentially working on the same campaign. What Surveyor does is it looks at the list of people that it's supposed to call, and the first thing it does is it checks to see if there are any scheduled callbacks. And if that scheduled callback time, date and time has arrived, it'll display that person next rather than the next person that was in this long list of people that I'm supposed to call. So that's how callbacks work. Well, what if I get a voicemail box when I call somebody on the phone? I could just hang up, but then they wouldn't know that, hey, Mr. Big Advertiser, I tried to get a hold of you to get your next advertisement in the newspaper. Now I can leave a message, but leaving a message is time consuming, and it's kind of tedious. And I have a tendency to kind of fumble around when I'm leaving messages. I wish that I could just create a pre-recorded message that says, "Hi, this is Matthew from Minneapolis Star Tribune. I'm sorry I missed you. I'd like to get in contact so that we could organize the next advertisement that you have in the newspaper. If you have a few minutes, if you could call me back at 801-642-4655, blah, 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 whatever you wanted to say." So what we've built into Surveyor is this thing called auto voicemail. And unfortunately, I don't have any samples in here. I should probably get some samples in here. But in here would be a list of pre-recorded voicemails that I recorded with my own voice. And it knows who I am because that's who logged in up here, right? So it's only going to display those pre-recorded voicemails that I've created. So I select the correct voicemail. If I want to hear it before I use it to make sure I've selected the right one, I can press the play button and listen to it before I send it. Or I can just select the right voicemail and press send. And it will immediately disconnect me from the call. So now I can go make another telephone call to someone else. But at the same time, 3CX is then leaving that voicemail for that customer. So I get full credit for that telephone call. The customer knows that I've tried to get in contact with them. They're instructed to call me back. So it's not a wasted telephone call if I get a voicemail box, but I didn't have to sit there taking the time to figure out, okay, well, what should I say in this voicemail? It's just click it and move on. We've got another tool, and I don't see it on the screen. You have to independently install these on the system because auto voicemail is a separate product that we've happened to also integrate that product into Surveyor. And we have another tool called Caller ID. And maybe nobody's installed it on this machine, but the idea here is that I'm going to make a telephone call to California, or maybe to New York, or maybe to South Africa. I don't know where I'm calling, but I look at this person's address and I go, oh, they're in California. Maybe their telephone number is a Wisconsin telephone number, but maybe they're actually in California. So when I call them, I want the caller ID to be local to where the person is that I'm calling. So I would select from a list of telephone numbers a telephone number that is local to Sacramento, California, if I'm calling into Sacramento, California. And then when I press the dial button, it's going to present that local telephone number to the contact rather than a New York telephone number. Because I think you'll agree, if I get a call on my cell phone and it says that it's a caller from New York City, I know I don't know anybody in New York City. So there's only one possibility, and that is that this is a sales marketing call. And I don't want to talk to that person. So I'm going to reject the telephone call, and then I'm going to report them as a spammer to my carrier. And now they can't call me ever again, but they also can't call anybody else because too many people have reported them to the carrier. So having control over the caller ID is really important when you're calling outside of your local geographic area. So that's another feature that's built into Surveyor. Again, we have reports. So there's a performance report that shows how many calls the agent has made. There's a sales report that shows how many sales they've made. There's a general call report. It's complaining because I made changes but didn't save them, but we're going to do it anyway. I don't have any example data, but you can see who was called, their telephone number, when, date, time, and it's easy to find them again. So much like the Power Dialer, it's super easy to group these people by campaign, by state, by whatever you want to do, simply by grabbing these fields and pulling them up. So nice reporting built into Surveyor. Again, it also has a little database built into it. You can search for them quite easily. So if I go in here and I say, find me a customer whose company name starts with a V, I go in there and there we go. We'll find a customer, and then I can add information about it. I can see history of all the notes that were taken about that person. I can see if they qualify for additional calls. So that's kind of what this guy is all about. So it's got a mini CRM built into it too. Again, super basic. It's just enough that if you have no CRM, you can keep track of all your contacts and all the conversations that happened with them. So now when a customer calls you, you can look them up in this database and see the history that's taken place with that person. Yeah, I was supposed to pay for my cable service and I just got paid, so I want to get paid. Okay, cool. Then let's put in here. He made his payment today, right? Save, and it knows who I am, so it's going to specify the date and time that the note was done and who saved the note. All right, and so that's kind of, in a nutshell, what Surveyor is all about. It's a preview dialer. I know all about that customer before it's dialed. I don't make a lot of telephone calls in comparison to a predictive dialer or a power dialer, but remember, the goal is not how many telephone calls I can make in a day. The goal is how many sales I can make in a day. And so for many organizations, a preview dialer is much more appropriate than a power dialer or a predictive dialer, but they can be used in conjunction with each other. Some general questions that people ask us is, do your dialers work with 3CX when 3CX is hosted in the cloud? And the answer is yes, it does, with one exception, and that is 3CX hosted services. 3CX does not allow any third-party tools, including their own third-party tool, which is the call flow designer. So there are a lot of restrictions about what you can do and what you can't do with the 3CX hosted service, and you can't even get access to the CDR files, for example. So yes, pretty much every hosting company in the world, whether that's Amazon or Google or One-on-One or Azure, all of those platforms, you can install 3CX and our dialers will work with them. Or you can potentially have them in the cloud. I think, here we go, cool. So I wanted to show you why or how our tools work in conjunction with 3CX. So on the right-hand side, you see a box that represents your 3CX server. That 3CX server can be running Linux or it can be running Windows. We're agnostic as to which one you use. I have now become a convert to running 3CX on Linux. It requires less hardware. There's less hacking activity. It is a much less complex, or can be a much less complex operating system, so it doesn't have the stability issues that Windows can have if you're installing 3CX on a retail PC with all kinds of bloatware on the machine. So Windows or Linux, we don't care. Then you would install 3CX on this Windows server, and then you would install our relay. And this is where we become incompatible with 3CX when it's the 3CX hosted service, because they won't allow you to install anything on their hosted instances of 3CX. Our relay contains our own VoIPTools REST API. For any of you who have been working with 3CX for a long period of time, there's been this rumor that 3CX is going to release a REST API. Well, that's been going on for probably 10 years and we still don't have one. So in the course of the last 14 years, as we've been building add-on tools for 3CX, it became necessary for us to have a REST API. So we built our own REST API. We also have a real-time events API that you can subscribe to and get those events. And how do you communicate with that API? It's over HTTPS. So that means that as long as you have a VoIPTools server and a 3CX server that can communicate with each other, either on-prem to on-prem or on-prem to cloud or cloud to cloud, we don't care. So that's why we can work with any tool. I should point out that the VoIPTools server, this is a server where you install our tools. You don't install our tools directly on the 3CX server. Instead, it's on a separate server. And there's some advantages to having this on a separate server. But the truth is that in the early days of VoIPTools, aka 14, 13 years ago, we used to install our tools right on the 3CX server. But 3CX came back and said, we'd really prefer that you not install any non-3CX software on the 3CX server. That's no SQL server, no web servers, no antivirus. They don't want you to have anything that isn't 3CX software running on the 3CX server. But how do you communicate with 3CX if 3CX has no API? And the answer is you can't. So we had to come up with a compromise with 3CX so that we install the relay on the 3CX server, but all the rest of our tools reside on a separate VM. That separate server has to be Windows because our dialers are Windows applications. They're web-based, but they run with SQL Server and Microsoft Internet Information Server. That's the web server. So if you look at the diagram here, you would install our tools on this server along with the free version of SQL Server Express and IIS. So there's no cost for these tools. They're free from Microsoft, but they all run on a separate server and the two of them communicate back and forth over an encrypted connection. So it's secure and safe and works really well. So again,
we do have a few questions, Matthew, if you'd like to take up.
Sure.
Yeah, we have, can we somehow remember caller ID, and when somebody is calling back, can it go to the same agent? It's a very good question.
So that would be a different feature, but it is absolutely possible to do. It would require that when the people call back, that call gets routed to a call flow designer application. That call flow designer application would then look at the call history generated by ad hoc telephone calls as well as calls made by the dialer, and whoever called this person last, it's going to get routed to that person. So yes, it isn't an existing feature, but one of the things that I should point out that's unique about dealing with VoIPTools versus Microsoft or Oracle or Google is you're talking to the owner of VoIPTools. And because I'm the owner, I can do whatever the heck I want as long as I have staff available to do it. So you can call me directly and ask questions about, can we build this? And we can build it for you. So that's a long answer to a short question that yes, it's possible to do. No, we don't have a tool to do that just yet, but it's an interesting idea. I don't see why we couldn't. We're adding new products all the time to our suite of tools. In fact, we're adding a new tool probably day after tomorrow. What's today? Wednesday. So Friday or Monday, we'll have a new tool out there, and I can give you a sneak peek of it real quick after we're done with this presentation. All right, so what infrastructure do you need? Well, 3CX has to be in the cloud or on-prem, Windows or Linux. The VoIPTools server has to be a separate server in the cloud or on-prem. We don't care, but it does have to be Windows. Surveyor requires almost nothing in terms of hardware. It's just a simple little web application, and the only time it really has to do anything is when they press next to get the next contact, or they press dial to make a telephone call. Otherwise, it's a fairly simple application. So Surveyor doesn't require much. Power Dialer, in contrast, is a pretty heavy application because it's making multiple simultaneous calls, and at the same time it's having to keep track how many calls are running on 3CX total, how many calls are still active that I generated, how many calls are waiting in the queue, what's the status of agents, how many agents are they currently on the phone. So the Power Dialer's a bit of a beefier machine. I want to mention that we have a new service that we started, I don't know, 3-4 months ago, where if you don't want to hassle with setting up a VM to run VoIPTools software, we can host it for you. And in fact, we're doing it essentially at our cost. So we went to Amazon and we said, Amazon, what does it cost for a VM of this size? And we marked it up a little bit just to cover our labor costs, but probably not quite enough to cover our labor costs. So if you don't want to hassle with all this infrastructure stuff, we've got dedicated staff that are available to set up a hosted solution for you where you don't have to do anything but access the web interface of the applications. So how do I purchase these dialers? Well, you can go to our website and purchase it directly, but what we'd really like you to do is to acquire it through your 3CX partner. The reason for that is that we're trying to maintain a good relationship with all the 3CX partners. We don't want to be seen as a competitor to 3CX partners. So we encourage you to go to your 3CX partner and acquire our tools through your 3CX partner. It's good for you because now you've got a liaison that you don't have to deal directly with us if you don't want to. And your partner, frankly, gets a little bit of a discount. So they get reoccurring revenue by selling our tools to you. The price you pay is the same, whether you buy it from us or you buy it from the partner, but the partner gets a little bit of a spiff on selling that tool with us, through us. You can also go to our website. I should mention that our tools are sold as a suite of tools. You don't purchase individual tools, you purchase VoIPTools. And with VoIPTools comes all of our recording management, power dialers, wall boards, reporting tools. Exporter is a great tool for collecting all the data that 3CX has so that you can write your own custom reports. All of our tools generate their own data as well, so you can report based on the data that's collected by our dialers and our wall boards. So we've got a whole bunch of tools. So I'd strongly encourage you to go out and take a look at all of the tools that we have, because we're probably at, I think with this new tool that we're about to release, we're probably at 35 different tools. And we've just talked about 2 of them. I don't know how long we've been talking, but it's taken a long time to just talk about it. So if you'd like to talk more about our tools, there's a number of ways that you can get a hold of us. Email, sales@voiptools.com. You can get somebody on live chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on our website, or you can call us directly in the United States. That's our telephone number there. Any other questions, Aman?
Yeah, we have another one. Can we put some audio during calls and saying that this call will be recorded, but also that audio must be included?
All right, so now we're getting outside of dialer calls, but let's talk about some of those other tools, shall we? So I'm going back to our website, and if I go to products and downloads, this is kind of a concise list of all of our tools here. Just a reminder to upgrade your relay if you've gone to Service Pack 4. All right, so there's some free tools that you can try out today. Just download them and they'll work. This little side panel was the menu thing that I was using to select the different applications. But these are our paid tools. So all of these guys. So, it took us an hour or more to talk about those dialers. Well, there's a whole bunch more that we've got in here. All right, so Let's expand this guy out here, and there's a new tool here called Barge Messages, and we'll log in here. This guy's going to be released Friday or Monday would be my guess. I am running an early version here, so if there's some flaws. All right, so what you effectively do is you come in here to prompts, and you create specific prompts that you want to play. And so this might be messages like your call is going to be recorded, or you might have some boilerplate language that once you've confirmed that this person wants to move forward with services or products that you want to have, you might have a disclaimer that you need to play in the middle of the conversation where it says, for legal reasons, you have to agree to the following, blah, 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 blah. So you just select which of the prompts you want to play and then press the play button, and it will look at you as you've logged in as extension 1001, and it will barge into that conversation, play the message, and then drop out of the telephone call. So this is barge messages. That's what this guy's about. So we got a lot of tools here that we haven't talked about. There's an agent greeting one. Here's another one that kind of goes to that last question. When an agent answers a queue call, it might be typical for them to say, hello, you've reached the technical support queue. My name is Matthew. Please remember that your call will be recorded for quality and what other purposes. How may I help you? That can be tedious to say over and over and over again 100 times a day every time you answer the queue call. So what agent greeting does, let's go into agent greeting if I get it to log in real quick. What it basically does is it allows the agent to record a message in their own voice. You select the queue, you create the message, and now whenever the agent answers the phone, whatever audio so basically what you do is you click the record button, it calls your extension, you answer the extension and says, please record the message after the beep. They record their message, and then it saves that as a file, and it's associated with a specific queue. So you select the queue, and now whenever I answer this queue, it'll say technical support. And if I create another one and I choose the sales queue, I can save a different message for it. So now when I answer the phone, before I say anything, it says, hello, this is Matthew. You've reached the sales queue at VoIPTools. Please be aware that your phone call will be, and you don't have to say all that stuff. So it saves your voice. It saves the tedium. You don't have to wonder whether or not the agent remembered to tell them that their call was going to be recorded. It makes it a very repeatable, consistent message and process as agents are answering the call. All right, guys. Well, I've been talking long enough. You've been very generous with your time. I appreciate that you've given me your time today. If you have more questions, again, come to our website, send us an email, sales or support, depending on which you're needing. So sales@voiptools.com or support@voiptools.com. Live chat is there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So you should be able to get a hold of us pretty much anytime. And again, of course, you can call us by phone as well.